we need to talk about building a startup in Canada. I am a third-time founder based in Toronto, and these are things that I wish I knew when I was starting out, and I want to share them with you. Before I start, I want to say that I love Canada and it is my home, but there are some things about it that make it unfriendly for startups, and perhaps we can work on some of them. So now with that said, let's start. Problem number one is customer urgency. Now, I noticed this in my first startup, but the number one thing that matters when you're first starting out is actually getting users and customers. It's not about investors, it's not about, building the perfect product. It's about getting your first few customers. And the problem is that even this first step is harder for Canadian startups. I had a prospect who kept pushing a meeting by a few weeks that eventually it was pushed by over 6 months. And I don't know what it is. Maybe it's the free healthcare and our higher life expectancy that makes everyone feel like we have infinite time to live and we don't need to get anything done today. We can just push it out to tomorrow. But a lack of customer urgency will kill your startup. So that's something you want to know. And you want to be aware that when you're serving the Canadian market, you're going to have this problem. The second problem is customer density. So again, customer acquisition is the number one thing that matters for your startup when you're starting out. And the problem with Canada is that not only are the customers less urgent, but they're also fewer of them. So let's look at the Canadian map. If you don't speak French, you can basically remove this. And no one lives here, so you can remove that too. And basically all you're left with are Vancouver and Toronto. And if you're an early stage startup and you can't afford flights back and forth, then you just basically pick one of them and that's your market. Obviously, this is a bit of an exaggeration and remote work still happens, but you get the point. Problem number three, talent. This one is going to be surprising to a lot of people. People think that Canada is great for talent because we have a lot of immigration, we have an educated population, but the reality for founders is actually quite different. The first reason is that Canada's talent is actually a term I don't want to use for people, but it's what's left. All the Waterloo grads, all the top graduates from the top universities essentially just leave Canada after they're done. They go to a big tech company or some other startup, or they build a startup in the US. 66% of software engineering grads in Canada leave for the US. 66%. The other 34% were either not talented enough or not ambitious enough. And that's the talent that you have access to in Canada. The second reason is that as a startup, you have to rely on equity to be competitive for compensation. And a Canadian startup valuation will not allow you to be competitive, to be able to attract the best talent, even among the talent that stays. So basically, as a Canadian startup, you don't really have great access to a lot of talent like everyone has you believe. You might have access to cheap talent, but that doesn't necessarily translate to the best talent. Problem number four, investor risk appetite. Now this is one that I think a lot of people already know about, but it's very much true. Early in my journey as a founder, I met someone who was very supportive of me. He spent multiple hours on the phone with me almost every day to give me guidance, warm intros, this book, and a lot of other things that gave me a lot of confidence in myself. He was also very involved in the Canadian startup ecosystem. So this was a guy who knew a lot and I learned a lot from. But when it came to suggesting a valuation for my startup, he gave me a number that was lower than the amount that US startups tend to raise for a very typical pre-seed. And so that was very disheartening. And this is the sad reality for Canadian startups in general. Even when they're barely launched, they're treated like existing businesses and valued based on their current metrics rather than based on potential. I grew up watching Dragon's Den, and when I watched Shark Tank for the first time, I was shocked by the willingness to invest and also the valuations that the startups in the US were getting. So basically in Canada, you're not going to get investment over a sketch you made on a napkin in a cafe, while in the US that's entirely possible. And that's a huge disadvantage that you have as a startup. Problem number five is the cost of living. Now, I don't think I need to convince Canadians that we have a cost of living problem here, but this high cost of living also discourages risk taking because you drain your savings so quickly, and it's so hard to find anyone who's able to work for equity because it's just so expensive to live here. People say that San Francisco is also very expensive, and sure, that's true, but in SF you're surrounded by people who are VCs and billionaires who are ready to give you cash when you need it. In Toronto, you're paying SF rent for bad weather. Problem number 6 is actually 3 problems in one that I'm calling friction. So the 3 problems are our winters, our public transit, and our parking. Now this sounds minor, but it really adds up. It's the friction of daily life. Bad public transit, expensive parking, and 5 months of winter mean people really just don't meet up that much. In SF or Miami, you bump into investors at coffee shops. In Toronto, everyone's just hiding inside because it's -20 outside and the subway's broken. You can't build a network from a living room. You also can't build a startup without a network and without meeting people. And that's just much harder in Canada. By the way, depending on your living situation, you might also have to worry about things like shoveling snow. And those are things that are removing time that you could be spending on your startup. Problem number 7 is the tall poppy syndrome. Whatever you're doing, you need to believe with your full heart and soul that you're going to succeed. We often hear success gurus like Alex Hormozi talk about the importance of self-belief, and I think it's very much true. If you don't believe that you're going to succeed, you're not going to take the most optimal actions. You're going to start hedging your actions instead of going all in. But this is a self-fulfilling failure because unless you go all in, you're unlikely to succeed. The problem is that failing once or twice before you fully reach your full success potential is inevitable. It is going to happen. And in Canada, failure is not celebrated. In SF, failing is a badge of honor. But in Canada, people ask you when you're going to go back to a real job. So basically, as a founder, you need delusional self-belief in order to succeed. And in Canada, it's very hard to get that. So those are the 7 things that I wish I knew when I was starting to build in Canada. I might make another video to talk about some of the positives as well. But let me know what you think in the comments, and I hope to see you next time. Thanks.